environment, which is us, our culture, what have you, selects for strains that are either very virulent or not very virulent. And I'll try to bring this out again and again. Now, did anybody think of an epidemic that was not caused by the activities of humans? A human epidemic? I was hoping somebody would. Because I have searched literature and never found an epidemic disease that couldn't be attributed to human activity. So think about that. And politicians won't. And they will not get ready for the next epidemic that's going to come. And we can predict right now probably where it will come from, because for the last 1,000 years, epidemics have been coming out of China. Why? Well, China is the one place in the world, and now Southeast Asia, where humans and animals live in the same house together. Perfect breeding place to get new strains of influenza. You live with pigs and chickens in the house with you, and ducks, and the ducks go out into the rice field and mix with wild migrating birds, which is the source of influenza virus. Perfect place. It's still happening. Every big influenza epidemic we know of has come out of China. Because now Southeast Asia may be a good breeding place. Okay, so viruses are important. I want to show you this week's issue of Science magazine. This is an antibody. This is what we make vaccines out of. This is not only going to help us against infectious disease, but when I talk about cancer, the only hope we have now of controlling cancer is through antibodies. It's the only way we can recognize proteins and activate them or inactivate them. And pharmaceutical companies have learned to make these vaccines with cell cultures. They can do it rapidly, but we won't make vaccines against influenza or anything for humans because of liability and because politicians want companies to be liable for what they do. You can't do it with vaccines. You know, you stick a pin in 1 million people, and the next 3 months there's going to be some terrible thing happen to some of those people. And they'll all blame it on the pinprick. They don't understand probability. We have communities like in I think I mentioned Northern California. 400 babies hospitalized, over 400. 10 of them died, and at great expense from whooping cough, for God's sakes. We've had the answer to whooping cough since the 1800s, late 1880s, when they developed the antiserum. It's really sad. And the same way with diphtheria, I don't know if I'll have time to tell you about how we use lies to influence people against vaccines. There's a whole group of people that will not understand probability for the use of vaccines. Started back in 1771, when I told you about it. Okay? Now, where do infections come from? Most of them come from a known parasite acquiring a new host, moving from one animal to the next. Another source is the mutations and combinations of similar parasites developing into new ones. Okay? In all cases, the environment shapes the virulence of the new parasite. Okay. That's an important lesson. We've known it really since the 1980s, but nobody will pay attention. Now, when I talk about influenza, my idea, or my purpose of the lecture, saying that the environment, the human beings, are responsible for the virulence of the parasites that they're dealing with. We go back to 1918 with the flu epidemic. And there has been this mentality that in 1918 this terrible influenza virus came out and killed maybe 100 million people, or 50 million the word. They didn't keep records in China and Asia and Africa, and so we don't know how many people were killed, but far more than died in the First World War, overall deaths. But a lot of writers that I happen to follow, back 20 years ago, and said, wait a minute, the reason that the 1918 virus was so virulent is we crowded hosts together so they could infect one another, and this selected for the most virulent, the most infectious of all diseases. After the spring of 1919, when there was demobilization of the troops and no more trench warfare and no more troop ships and no more army camps, some people would tell the virus disappeared. It didn't disappear. The H1N1 was still here. It just became mild because the ones that killed the fastest didn't have a chance to get out and infect somebody else because they were too far away. That's an important concept. We create the virulence of our parasites. Now, if you look at the world population and what's happening in Southeast Asia, it will scare the hell out of you. And people that are interested in politics and interested in that sort of thing, I really advise you to look up on your computers, that's CDC reference at the end of your notes. Prospect for emerging infections in the East and Southeast Asia 10 years after the SARS epidemic. They used the SARS epidemic as a rapidly occurring epidemic. I'm going to shoot down that concept in just a moment when I get to SARS. All right. Now, changing environment. I want you to understand that epidemic disease like malaria, endemic disease like malaria, doesn't happen where there's no mosquitoes. Cholera doesn't happen where there's clean food and water. Sexually transmitted diseases does not occur in a non-promiscuous society. The head of the World Health Organization, who is in charge of the HIV epidemic, says, look, if young people would just stick to their generation and only have sex with the people the same age you are, all sexually transmitted diseases would disappear. You follow that? Because now, if these dirty old men are giving it to the young teenage girls for money, and in Africa, there's places that if you have sexual contact with a virgin, it helps take care of your sexual diseases. I mean, what a disastrous culture. But if we would not have these, if the old people, the old men didn't give it to the young girls, and the old girls give it to the young men. Too bad. We need to change the culture. Now, while I'm on a soapbox here, I want you to understand that when science conflicts with culture, culture wins, science loses. Let me give you an example of a disease for which an antibiotic cured the disease. Every known disease back in the 1950s, every known case of gonorrhea was easily cured with penicillin or soap. Okay? Did that wipe out gonorrhea? No, we had a cultural change. We had the pill, we had the feminine movement, and gonorrhea exploded, even though it could be cured with a shot of penicillin. Well, guess what? It's now resistant to penicillin, resistant to tetracycline, resistant to nearly all of our antibiotics, and getting worse. The main reason is because it isn't the pill, which a lot of anti-pill people would like to blame it on, but simply because teenagers are far more susceptible to gonorrhea than older people. An older woman has sex with a man with gonorrhea, only has about a 50-50 chance of contracting the disease. A teenager having sexual contact with a person with gonorrhea has a 100% chance of getting it. And that's why we have this damned epidemic. It's unnecessary. But antibiotics are not the answer. When somebody comes up with an antibiotic against HIV, don't believe that's going to be the answer. First thing that happens is people say, oh, I can be cured. I can be as careless as I want to. I don't need to use condoms. And unfortunately, or fortunately, we don't have an antibiotic or a vaccine for HIV. But we're on the verge of it. That's what this is about. They're called broadly neutralizing antibodies. And there's some hidden antibodies in the HIV genome that, if there isn't too many virus particles, will stop an infection. It cannot be used as therapeutic, because once you have HIV, there are so many, billions a day, that anything we have to treat it just can't keep up. So, but this is going to revolutionize not HIV, but there are the glimmer of hope with influenza, that there are these, they're hidden. They're hidden in the genome and influenza and the H protein, but hard to get at and very difficult to make a vaccine that would work. Not a therapeutic vaccine, but on a theoretical basis, if you could give everybody one shot when they were young, they'd be immune to all influenza viruses for the rest of their life. Maybe. It probably won't happen. But where it will happen, and has happened in a few cases, is with cancer. Because again, this antibody antigen idea is one of the most important breakthroughs in science, in biological science that we have. And if we're ever going to control cancer, we're not ever going to cure it. But if we ever control it, it will be through the use of antibodies and therapeutic vaccines. And it's too bad that there's groups of people who say, well, the vaccine's a government idea, the government's bad, therefore vaccines are bad. Well, it's not so. Keep that in mind. When I talk to you about cancer in a couple of months, I'll get into more details. Now, SARS. What can we learn from SARS? How many of you remember the SARS epidemic? Yeah. It scared the hell out of you. turned out to be a coronavirus. Coronaviruses make up about 30 or 40% of the common colds. Now, what does that tell you about coronaviruses? When they come into a population that's never been exposed to them before, they can be highly virulent, like SARS. And there's just some fascinating stories available. The one that's one of your references there shows how one person came from, it was the doctor, as a matter of fact, came from Guangdong, China, where SARS broke out, checked into the Metropole Hotel, the name has been changed, so you won't go there, in Hong Kong, and infected indirectly 300 people. The outbreak wasn't even on the world story. They kept it suppressed in China. And it wasn't until it appeared in Toronto and Hanoi that we became aware of it. But what did we learn about this? It was so severe, and being a coronavirus like the common cold, it didn't become infectious until a person got a fever. Now remember that, because I'm going to compare it to influenza. But you could screen for SARS coming off an airplane just by having an infrared detector and detecting anybody with a fever. It's easy enough to do. And you either isolated them or put them in a hospital if they were sick, or told them to stay at home until we know what happened. Because within 4 or 5 days, if you had SARS, you would be infectious. And then you'd have to stay isolated for another week. Well, as it turned out, mostly medical people, doctors and nurses and orderlies and people in the hospital where these people were put, they came down with the SARS virus. Now, within a year, the SARS virus was gone. Okay? Now let's think a minute what happened to the ancestors of the common cold viruses that we have that are due to coronaviruses. What does mommy do when the kid, kindergarten or school, gets sick with a cold, a bad cold? Stays home. If a kid turns out sick in the school, it's to the principal's office or to the school nurse. They're isolated. The severe cases don't have a chance to spread. But if Johnny just has the sniffles, well, let him go to school anyway, and he spreads around this mild case. So when the coronaviruses in olden times, which obviously the cases we have coronaviruses in our own community, common colds makes up, some people say 30%, other people say 40%, but a lot of them, or even any of them for that matter, what happens when a kid gets really sick? He gets isolated. This selects for the milder cases. And we'll keep it that way until we change our culture and don't select. One of the exam questions I used to give on this section was, what would happen if we made everybody with a cold or who got sick with a virus stay home? Don't go to work. Don't sneeze on the desk. Don't touch the computer. We would select for the milder cases, the cases where people didn't even know they had them. We don't do that, and you think that your co-worker who is being brave to come in and work with a rotten cold and headache and whatever, well, he's just spreading it. He coughs on the desk, you come in, put your hand on the desk, then you put your hand to your face, he gets into the tear ducts, down in the back of the throat, and you got a cold. School kids are wonderful. They're sneezing and rubbing and spitting on each other all the time. They bring it home to grandma and grandpa and fathers and mothers and fathers. So, have we done this? Yeah, there have been some enterprising people on the coronaviruses, has traced them back, and they think the last coronavirus, that, at least the one that they studied on mutation changes, came about 800 years ago. And SARS was on its way to becoming much more mild before it was eliminated easily by isolation techniques. It never even got a chance to become mild. Now we got the new one called MERS, Middle East Syndrome. It's got about a 50% mortality in the people that get it. Current thinking is it came from bats, went to camels, it's a common disease among camels, and a few cases have spread over into the human population. If they isolate those people, they'll probably stop the epidemic. If they don't, it will become, I'm sure, a mild disease. I could be wrong, but I'm not sure I'll be here long enough to find out. Okay? Any questions on that? This is what we learned from the SARS. First few cases are always severe, and then selection takes place. Now I'm going to go to 1918. In 1918 it was called the grip. Later on it was called knock me down fever. Now we have a history in Europe of periodic fevers coming, killing the infants and old people and moving on. It came from the east and moved towards the west. Probably was into the west. Went out of China just like all the last ones. I've got in the notes here how you identify it through the H and the N. And so far only H1, 2, and 3 have infected humans. To make an H5 go to ferrets or mammals, any mammal by the airborne route takes a lot of changes. But don't worry, evolution is mixing all the possible combinations. So eventually those genes will get out into the human population. Probably be very severe at first, but the eventual virulence should depend on how close people are. And we've known this since the 1980s. First chicken factory in Pennsylvania. A mild case of flu entered into the chicken factory, and within 3 or 4 months was 100% lethal. They killed all the chickens within 30 miles and stopped research on the virus. Too bad. You could have learned something. You could have learned that crowd hosts together, you're going to get a virulent virus. It takes maybe 3, 4, 5 months. So what happened in 1918? Now, remember this list of characteristics of human strains. It is important. Because with flu, particularly those people that don't get sick from it, they're the spreaders. That's why isolation and quarantines just don't work very well. They work some. We have good evidence that when 9/11 happened, and we stopped all air traffic, that delayed the 2001 we had the terrible disaster. We stopped all air traffic, and that delayed that year's influenza, the seasonal influenza, delayed it 2 weeks. So it does help. If we had a really highly lethal evolution of a flu virus, what should you do? Well, get people as far apart as you can closed the schools, for God's sakes, because that's where kids spread it and take it home to their parents and their grandparents. Nobody thinks about that. But what did we do in 1918? A mild epidemic started in the spring of 1918. It wasn't called knock-me-down fever then, it was just called the grip. A couple of people died, which always happens. You know, influenza probably contributes to the death of 60,000 people at least every year in the United States. It's a good way to get pneumonia or finish off a person who's got cancer or something like that. Anyway, in the springtime, it was mild grip. By fall, it was a devastating illness that would kill within 24 hours or less. Now, we've got indirect evidence that like medical personnel that were working with people with the first wave that came in 1918. It was a new virus, a new H1N1. Previously been an H3 or something like that. The people, the doctors and nurses that got that in the spring were more resistant to the second wave that came 6 months later. Now that's indirect evidence. But there was some, when you get a flu shot, it's only good for about 6-7 months at the very most. You have to get a booster every year. So I got my flu shots last week or so. That will last me until next spring. And then we hope that the seasonal flu goes to the tropics and then on down to the southern winter and doesn't come back again until next October. Now the dynamics of this movement of human influenza to the northern hemisphere mixes down there around Singapore and in the tropics. That Singapore is the only place that's done any studies on this. And then moves on to the southern hemisphere. This is not totally understood. We don't know why that is. Whether it's climate, whether it's humidity, whatever it is. Flu is seasonal and you can't avoid it. But these are the characteristics. Flu replicates so rapidly that your immune system, when you get exposed to a disease, you develop immunity to that disease. It only lasts for about 6 months or so, and then it sort of goes into, I'll call it a memory bank. And when you're stimulated with that same disease again, it takes about a week for the memory bank to say, oh, I remember how to fight this disease, and starts producing the killer cells and the stuff that is in the immune system. Any of you go into biology, you're going to study that. I don't have time, even if I understood it. It's changing all the time. But the point of the matter is it takes you 1 to 2 weeks to marshal your memory bank on how to fight the disease. Well, the damn flu will hit you in 2 days. So you could have had the flu in spring of 1918 and be susceptible to a new strain of flu in the fall. But you would have had some immunity left over, and you would have had something in your memory bank that would not prevent you from getting it, but would prevent you from dying from it. And we got fairly indirect evidence that this is true. We haven't reproduced the spring influenza. We don't have any samples of it in a specimen. We have reproduced the 1918 major epidemic. We don't have any from the 1919 demise. Now, some of the stuff you read says, oh, it disappeared in 1919. No, it didn't disappear. it became seasonal flu and recurred every year until 1957, which is when I came to Boca Raton, in the midst of a flu epidemic. It wasn't as bad as 1918, only about 1/10 the mortality. You've got this list here, and you can sort of go through it. But there was widespread black marketing of the vaccine. We divided the vaccine up into, instead of one dose, we made 10 doses of it and gave it intradermally instead of subcutaneously, which was difficult. I had to kick a drug salesman out of my office because he offered to give me some on the black market if I would pay extra, and I said, go to hell. And thank God that company, I never let that guy in the office again. The company went out of business in a couple of years, so it's unimportant. But it was a bad epidemic. People were sick. And we simultaneously had a measles epidemic. So one adult with the measles, good God, he was kicking chickens out of the house. I made a house call on him. And we also had a chicken pox epidemic. And let me tell you, chicken pox in an adult is no fun. It's easily lethal, about 25% lethal. And chicken pox pneumonia will kill you and requires going on a ventilator. Now, we do have an antibiotic that does work to a certain extent on chicken pox. We have an excellent vaccine for chicken pox. But when an adult is exposed to chicken pox, immediately got to put them in the hospital, give them intravenous acyclovir, and the only 2 cases I ever had, we had no problems stopping. Now, we've had a number of epidemics, none of them as severe as 1918. Why do you suppose that was? People weren't crowded together. But the thing to worry about is what's happening to the world's population. And business people, oh, we want growth, you know, more customers. Well, growth has got some side effects that are not very nice, particularly since we are not ready with the necessary vaccine-making abilities. Companies now are working on cancer vaccines. That's the latest thing, and they are making billions. You know, they got vaccines, don't work very well, and I'll explain next couple of months why it is, but it's $11,000 a month just for the shots that will keep you miserably alive for another 2 or 3, 4 months, yes.
So if the influenza virus migrates from here and then goes to the tropics, are they, those countries where that goes to, are they producing vaccines as well and vaccinating
We have
them?
CDC people there checking on the various strains, particularly when it gets down to Australia. And the 1918 flu incidentally killed half of the Aborigines down there. It was so severe. But we're getting the strains, and that gives us the 6 months it takes to make the vaccine in the 1950s way through eggs to get to us by October.
So they use those to kind of predict which vaccine to use?
They use that to predict which ones are coming.
And what's the percentage of effectiveness on getting the right vaccine from doing that, or about?
I'd say 70 to 80%. But the trouble is, 70 to 80%, when you figure out that the flu viruses are getting a little more virulent. We're not just sure why. I suspect it's because of increased population. but the flu vaccine doesn't work as well as we'd like. But it probably keeps us old people not from getting the flu, but from dying from the flu.
Getting so sick.
So it's controversial. But the main thing is we need to use the same techniques that we're using to make cancer vaccines, which are industrial techniques of cell cultures. We isolate the cells that make the vaccine and grow them, and you can produce huge numbers for the whole world in a matter of months, not 6, 8, 10 months, 1 or 2 months or less.
So this research on vaccinations and that too, you said the World Health Organization in like southeastern countries, because their governments aren't doing it as much as Western nations, so is it governed from government to government, or is it world government organizations kind of managing this whole thing?
I'd say it's American politicians mostly, because we're the people that make them,
Okay.
and we're the people that make money from them. But because of liability and the misunderstanding of politicians in general, the public still says, oh, it's that terrible virus. It isn't the terrible virus. It's the environment that selects for a terrible virus. You're always going to have bad colds or bad cases of influenza that'll kill. And it's your choice, our choice, to perpetuate those highly virulent, more infectious, or should we try to perpetuate the mild cases that give us immunity?
Thank you.
Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I hope I make sense of it. The influenza having this ability to replicate so fast means that your memory storage for immunity doesn't get turned on for a week at least. And all it takes for influenza is 2 days. And it's at its peak replication. So we're always going to have to deal with it. We just want to be sure it's a mild strain and not a bad strain. Okay. Influenza can mix. We used to think it was just they mixed in pigs, where pigs and people lived together in the same house in China, and the ducks go out in the rice field and get it from a wild bird, bring it in, give it to the pig in the house when they bring them in at night, and then the pig, which can get human influenza as well as pig influenza, the same time it has a human influenza, it gets a bird influenza. They mix, and then the pig gives it to a human, and you've got a human influenza that is highly lethal for a while. But it takes time for that newly formed virus to develop its ability to hook into human people. And it always takes at least 3, 4, 5 months. You just can't do it any faster. Or I can't predict the future, it just never happened. We've never had a virus come out of the wild like in the movie Contagion, where it came out of the wild into a pig, from a pig to a chef, and from the chef to the world population. Maybe it can happen. Evolution is more clever than you are. But the point is, it's never happened, and I wouldn't count on it. I think that we should work on how to handle these things when they do occur. A little bit less maybe of the Indiana Jones type of guy that goes out in the wild and sees what's happening to the monkeys. But our ancestors, your ancestors, all had HIV type of viruses. But the human branch that broke off as it went from the jungles to the savannah got cut down to such a small population, which is called a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck, that the HIV got left in the jungle and we didn't take it out. We didn't get it again until about 1940. When it came from the chimpanzees, eating chimpanzee meat, and broke out in various villages in Africa. Okay, almost done. Let me go to the questions. Oh, there's one thing about the swine flu. One of the remarkable things about the swine flu that came a couple of years ago, the new swine flu, as compared to the 1976 swine flu, which were similar but not identical. Old people didn't seem to get it. Now, why was this? Was it because old people had been exposed to more influenza viruses and just had more antibodies to it? Or was it the people that got vaccinated in 1976 have some residual of immunity towards swine? We still get it, we just don't get as sick from it. Old people haven't done it. There's no way to prove that I know of right now. But it's an interesting concept that maybe the swine flu disaster, which is described on the page here, and a quote from the New York Times, and I was suckered into that. I was in favor of giving it because, 500 cases? Well, the 500 cases was an H3N2 that was seasonal flu at the time, had nothing to do with the swine flu in Fort Dix, which was only 2 cases. So that was poor judgment on the CDC's part to base a mass vaccine on just 2 cases. But everybody